just announced that the Russian invaders suffered another defeat. Following is an excerpt from a post that Gerashchenko made on one of his media accounts in which he announced the defeat of the invaders. Together with the 3027 National Guards Brigade, members of the Special Squad Code 9.2 were able to track down and destroy the T-90 Provi tank, which was considered to be the pride of the Russian defense industry. Honor to those who have defended Ukraine. The Russian army is losing tanks and other armored vehicles at an increasing rate on a daily basis. During the past few days, the Ukrainian army has focused their assaults on the Bakhmut line on the tanks and armored vehicles that are being used by the Russian invaders. The Russian tanks and armored combat vehicles that were trying to advance in Bakhmut were destroyed by the 59th Motorized Brigade through the use of explosives. An ambush set by the 59th Motorized Brigade for a Russian tank and armored vehicle platoon resulted in their capture. The tanks that belonged to the Russian invaders were attempting to cover their soldiers so that they could advance in Bakhmut, but the Ukrainian soldiers were aware of both the tanks and the soldiers that they concealed. The Russian invaders were being watched closely at all times. Soldiers from Ukraine were stationed on the hills that looked out over the city. We are holding off until the time is just right. Of attack. The T-72 tanks used by the Russian invaders were now able to be seen very clearly on the target that the Javelin missiles were aiming at. When the time was right, the missiles were launched into the air. After being struck by the missiles, the tanks went up in flames. The units that made up the 59th Motorized Brigade were responsible for the destruction of Russian tanks. The BMP armored vehicles that belonged to the Russian invaders were being pursued by another brigade unit. The Russian armored vehicles came under heavy fire from the Ukrainian soldiers. The invading Russians driving the vehicle were unable to maintain control. Artillery fire was used to destroy the armored vehicles that were trapped in the corner. The Russian Federation is still making massive losses in Bakhmut. The significance of the Ukrainian Air Force in this conflict is made abundantly clear by the operations that have just taken place. In the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, in addition to the ongoing clashes that are taking place in the territories that have been occupied, a number of new developments are taking place in the airspace of both countries. For this reason, tanks and armored vehicles are just as effective in air operations as they are on the ground, while fighter jets, helicopters, and missiles are effective in ground operations. Losses sustained by the Russian army in the air are increasing at the same rate as those sustained on the ground, which means that overall, the Russian army is suffering greater and greater setbacks. The Russian occupiers have suffered yet another casualty as a result of the recent incident in Baghdad. This brings the total number of Russian deaths in Iraq to 3. Since Russia began its occupation of Ukraine, Bakhmut has been a witness to hundreds of thousands of clashes both in the air and on the ground. To the point that the Ukrainian army reported that hundreds of fights took place in Baghdad in just one day, the level of violence was so high. In the Battle of Bakhmut, the Russian invaders suffered losses of tens of thousands of soldiers and tons of equipment. The situation in Bakhmut has worsened over the past day, as evidenced by the loss of the Russian Air Force. During their shift at Bakhmut, members of the 93rd Separate Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Army heard the sounds of aircraft overhead. This noise was made by a Russian Su-24 fighter aircraft. After heading in the direction of the source of the sound, the soldiers arrived at Bakhmut just in time to see a Russian fighter jet flying overhead. However, the Russian fighter plane was oblivious to the soldiers. Almost immediately, the brigade soldiers began making preparations to shoot down the Russian fighter plane. The plane was easy to spot as it flew through the sky above Bakhmut.
An Excalibur projectile accurately destroyed a moving Russian tank. Later, another tank is destroyed while trying to enter the city. Ukrainian artillerymen ruthlessly destroy enemy vehicles. Anything marked with the letter Z must be destroyed and burned by any means necessary. The Russians can barely break into Bakhmut with armored vehicles. Therefore, they rely on the infantry and constantly send them into assaults. Against them, the Ukrainians mainly use 60 and 80 caliber mortars. This is the most effective weapon against the advancing infantry. Fire adjustment is conducted from a hidden observation post. Each successful hit brings joy to the Ukrainian commanders. Mortars almost never stop in Bakhmut. On the eastern side, the fighting is already taking place directly on the streets of the city. The enemy is trying to occupy the buildings and turn them into strongholds. Once peaceful houses become a battlefield. Ukrainians have to fight for every street, for every house. The most difficult thing is to knock the enemy out of the buildings. To do this, you have to use a large caliber machine gun. And in the most difficult situations, only tanks can help. The Russians are not afraid to use fighter jets, knowing that the Ukrainians can easily shoot down their planes. In these footage, you can see a downed Russian Su-25 on fire. The pilot ejected and parachuted down to ground. Ukrainians also actively use aviation, Mi-8 helicopters. But the main striking force is still artillery. The Russian troops try to destroy the most valuable Ukrainian M777 howitzers by attacking them with Lancet kamikaze drones, and they often succeed. Sometimes, the Lancet hits projectiles near the howitzer. In this video, we see how a Ukrainian soldier is trying to save shells from detonation. Dangerous, but necessary work. The M777 howitzer can still be repaired, but the shells cannot. Exploding, they can do more damage than a Russian drone. In order to protect the howitzers, the Ukrainians cover them with such nets. The Russians also use the Lancet drones to destroy other important Ukrainian weapons, such as the Stormer HVM air defense system. But Ukrainians also have kamikaze drones. On this video footage, you can see how they are used on enemy armored vehicles. Tank destroyed too. And on this video, Ukrainian drones tracked down and destroyed 2 Russian air defense systems. Ukrainians destroy enemy armored vehicles with artillery strikes. The Excalibur's unique high-precision guided projectile allows them to destroy tanks with pinpoint accuracy. It is controlled by aerodynamic rudders and uses GPS. In fact, it turns Ukrainian howitzers into large-caliber sniper rifles, capable of hitting single targets tens of kilometers away. The Russians can only dream of such accuracy. They don't have high-precision artillery at all. Because of this, they spend more ammo than they need. But most of all, Russians love to use MLRS systems. This is the most indiscriminate weapon ever made. The Bakhmut city and its surroundings look like a landscape after the First World War just because of this type of weapon. Hundreds and thousands of exploding shells destroy houses and trees, mixing everything with the ground.